Okay, good chatting with you. Okay, good morning, all. Today we are talking about groups. And the good news is that this is a very short presentation because this is actually a relatively simple subject. But to begin with, my name is Douglas Hemphill. I'm one of the campus instructional designers. And with me today is one of my colleagues, Carrie Mocyk, who is one of my fellow instructional designers. Also on the distance learning support team, we have Kathi Dutton and Theresa Gilliard-Cook. So if you see their names pop up anywhere, they're one of us. So to start with, I'm just going to share my computer. And so this is the start page that you will always wind up on when you come into Brightspace. So I'm going to go into one of my practice courses. Now, the one downside of this that I will tell you is we have a limited number of student accounts that are used for practice people, and we don't want to use real students for recorded items. So some of this stuff may seem a little empty just because I only have like 4 or 5 students to work with. But the first thing I'm going to do is go to groups. And Carrie, do you have any reason to keep these groups?
Nope, not at all.
So we'll start fresh. So when you first come in, this is what you'll see, just a blank page for manage groups. And the first thing you have to do is set up a category for your groups. And this is another unfortunate time when Brightspace decided to use the term category when maybe it shouldn't have. So just be aware that the category here is different from the category you see when working with the grade book, which is also different from the category that you see when you're interacting with the various assessment tools. In this case, the best way to think of a category is one set of teams. So let's say I have 2 big projects. So where I want to use different team makeups on the projects, then I'd make one category for my first team. One category for my first set of projects, and that would have its own set of teams, and one category for my second project, which would have its own set of teams. And I'll demonstrate this for you. So the first thing I'm going to do is just click new category. And I'm going to give the category a name. So this is going to be project 1. The description, we really don't use. There's no particular need to use it, but it is there if you want to use it. Now, the meat and potatoes of this is really the enrollment type. Now, the first option simply gives you how many groups do you want. We aren't going to put anybody in them. The second option is, okay, I want groups that each have X number of members in them, and the system will create as many groups as that requires. Or the reverse of that, I want 3 groups, and it'll take however many students you have in the class and divide them among the groups as evenly as it can. And then you get the same thing except with self-enrollment options. And then there's a single user member specific group, which the primary reason you would do this is if you wanted to use a discussion forum as a journal, because it would allow you to make a discussion where each student can only see their posts and your posts and nobody else's. In this case, though, we're going to start with just 3 groups, and we'll see what that brings us. And then the next question is, what do you want this called? So if you're only using one set of groups, it can be something as simple as group, and then it'll make group 1, group 2, group 3. But I do want to avoid confusing names, so I wouldn't want to call this project, because then it'll be a category project 1, but group project 1, project 2, project 3. So that's a good way to confuse people. So we're going to call this groups for project for first project. And then it just asks, do you want to make this visible to new students? This is specifically the category name and the group description. So it doesn't really matter whether you're making that visible. Anytime I'm randomly creating groups, I'm usually going to randomize the users in the groups. That's kind of the whole point. And then what do I do with people that enter the course late? And so, or even at the start of the course, because I could supposedly create the groups before the course started, and then people would be shuffled into groups as they came in. Or do I just want to handle those particular enrollments manually? There are the options to build discussions and assignments here, but I usually build the assignment or the discussion separately and turn it into a group assignment. I just find that easier to keep in my head as a workflow. Lockers are simply file sharing tools. You honestly are probably better off in using Google Drive for most things. So at this point, I've given it a project name. I've told it how I want the groups to be created, and I've given it individual group names. So I'm going to save this. And it does say it'll take a few minutes in the background. I have never seen it take more than like a minute. And so now I have my groups for the first project 1, groups for the first project 2, and I can see that each of them has 2 students in them. And the reason it's saying 2 out of 3 is if I actually went to look at my user enrollment. Actually, I'm not sure why it's saying 2 out of 3 there. Because usually it would just say there's 2 members in this group. Oh, okay. What it's doing is I told it to create groups of three users each, but I don't have enough students to fill that out. So it's telling me that out of a possible 3 students, there are 2 students enrolled in each of these groups. Like I said, the fun of playing with a very small practice pool. So now just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and create a new group and pretend that this is for project 2. And this time I'm just going to tell it I just want to create 2 groups. I'm not doing anything else. And so you see now I don't have any members in these because I haven't put anybody in here yet. And you can also see the issues the first time I named it groups for first project, and it looked nice. This time I named it groups for project 2, and it looks a little bit more confusing. Now, in this case, I want to handle my enrollments for this. So I'm going to make sure that I'm selected on the group that I want, or on the category that I want, which is project 2. And I'm just going to grab my pull down here and say, I want to enroll users. And now it shows me everybody in the class with the option to say which group I want each of them to go into. This will show up to 200 students per page, so we haven't run into an issue where the paging causes an issue yet, but just be aware if you do ever have a course that's bigger than that, that may be a concern. So that is how you create groups. Now, once I have groups, I can do things with them. The most common thing is going to be group assignments and group discussions. So if I go to an assignment, the most important thing to know is once an assignment is created, I can no longer change the assignment type. Sorry, once work is submitted in an assignment. So I need to set up whether an assignment is a group assignment or not before anybody submits a work. So when I go in and create a new assignment, everything here is normal. I'm going to leave this ungraded so it doesn't ask me a bunch of questions. But all I'm going to do is click submission and completion, change this to a group assignment, and then select which set of groups I want to use. And then when I save it, that is now a group assignment. You do not have to do anything else. It will automatically handle the rest behind the scenes, and you can tell it's a group assignment by that little tag there that shows 3 people. The other major alternative is discussions. And here it's the same thing. You have to do this before the discussion starts, but it's the same general idea. When I create a new discussion, I've got the option to change it to a group discussion and say which set of groups I want to have access to that. And what's nice now, again, I can see this as a group discussion. When a student goes in this, they will only see the members of their own group. When you go in it, by default, you will see everybody, but you've got a filter right here that I can change which set of groups which group I'm looking at. So remember, I assigned this to group 2, so this would be the first set of groups. This would be the second set of groups. And same thing when I evaluate it. Oh, and I made this, did I make this ungraded? I probably did. When I go in to assess it, I can view by groups rather than individuals. Now you aren't going to see much here because there's no post, but you can see I've got the 2 people in group 1 and the 2 people in group 2. And the main thing is just remember that every time you're changing this, you need to hit apply. And that is the very brief introduction to groups and their main usage. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor to any questions. Well, apparently I'm awesome. I'm trying to think if there's any other niche cases.
Doug, I actually do have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi. So my question is in the names of the groups. So I have one class where I have groups, and I usually give the groups clever names. It's a rhetoric of film class. So I usually give them names like, Team Tarantino or Team, Burton. Can I change that name, those names individually so it doesn't say like groups for first project? Is there a way to
Yeah.
give each one an individual name?
Yeah.
Okay.
So once the groups are created, just go to the groups
Mhm.
page and make sure you're looking at the set of groups that you want, and just click on the first or click on the name of the group, and you can change the group names individually right there. Just don't touch the group code number. That's what actually, from what I understand, helps tell the system which group is which. So, but you can change the first line. So yeah, you can have Team Bluebirds and Team Red Sox and Team Yankees or Team Tarantino.
Thank you.
Though I would guess the attrition rate in that one's pretty high. Again, if there's other questions, just feel free to let me know. What I'm trying to look at. So I'm trying to remember how to hide specific materials by group. So with assignments and discussions, it's pretty straightforward because you just use the group tools and then you attach any information that you want them to have access to that particular discussion or to that particular group. But on the off chance that for whatever reason you wanted to have an entire folder that was only available to one group, uh think it is okay. So add dates and restrictions, and then it's actually a release condition. And you say that it's based on group enrollment. And I can do it by a group set or by an individual group. And now only members of that group can see that as soon as I hit update, and it tells me under that folder that there are conditions, and that condition is that only people that are members of groups for the first project one can have access to this folder now. And you can do the same thing for any individual document. Just go edit properties in place and then click add dates and restrictions, and you'll get that release condition option. Though, as with most things in Blackboard, there are multiple winding roads to Rome. So there are other places you can add those restrictions in for an individual item.
And by Blackboard, he means Brightspace.
That's what I said. I don't know what you're talking about, and it is recorded.
Actually, I just was working with a faculty member. They were trying to figure out how to share class recordings only to a small set of students that maybe missed class, and they just want to allow them to see the recording, but not share the recording with everyone to encourage students to come to the class. And what you just described of creating a module and then setting it to only allow the group. And then each week he's going to change out the group, who's allowed to see it.
So yeah, you could certainly do it that way. The other way to do it would be just to set the individual users for the for each video, and the only reason I might suggest the latter is that,
Well,
because otherwise, every time the group has changed, the people in that group will be able to see all of the previous videos.
yeah, we have a system in place, but just knowing that's a different use for groups.
We do have another question. I think Linda has a question.
Okay.
Yes, I have a class where I have some readings that I want the students to do in groups, like to separate, and I want to use, for some of them, it's like one reading that I want to separate and have certain groups look at a particular portion of that reading, and then like assign like a certain number of pages to one group and a certain number of pages of that same reading to another group. And it's all in, the reading is in Hypothesis. I have it set up in Hypothesis so that they can do group annotations. So I have to set up the annotations as group, because like I just learned that like I have to have my group set before then I can assign that to groups. But is that going to prevent students from seeing from students who don't have that particular reading from seeing that document?
So Hypothesis is a third-party tool, so we don't know much about it. But based on the way groups usually work in Brightspace, the answer would be no, they will not be able to see the rest of the document.
Okay.
And that's, again, I would go back to Hypothesis and describe your use case in detail and say, is there a way for me to do this? But usually what I would do in a case like that is actually push everything out to Google Docs and then manage the read-write capabilities on the Google Doc. But even then it would have to be presuming you had three groups, it'd have to be the document broken up into three different ones. So yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is a complicated workflow, so unfortunately there's not going to be a simple solution to it.
So okay, thank you. I think
Doesn't mean it's not. Sorry.
Yeah, I think what I'll do then is I'll actually post the document twice, once just as a PDF and the other as a Hypothesis document, so then everybody can see the PDF. And then if everybody can't see the Hypothesis document except the groups, then that's okay, because then they can still read the PDF.
Okay, yeah, that would be
Yes.
fine. I was working under the
No.
assumption you wanted everybody to see everybody's comments.
Well,
but
see,
yeah.
I do. Yeah,
Oh,
I
okay.
do. I want the whole class to see their comments, but I only want certain groups to
Groups
work
working
on
on each
creating the
section.
comments, at least the
Yep.
first set.
Yeah. And again, I'd direct you back to the Hypothesis to see what their thoughts are on that. Because sans Hypothesis, I would have a completely different way of doing it, but I don't know enough about Hypothesis to make comments on what they may or may not be able to do, and the way I would do it is complicated.
Okay.
So doesn't mean it's not a good system. Sometimes, for good education, we need things that on the surface are a bit more complicated, but it does mean that unfortunately it takes more work from the faculty side to make things work right.
Right. Okay. Well, that works. I'll check out Hypothesis documentation and the groups thing and maybe ask Christy and stuff and see.
Yeah, I would actually reach out to Hypothesis help directly.
What's the question about Hypothesis?
So that's John King. He's one of the on-campus Hypothesis experts. So Linda, would you mind repeating the scenario to him?
Oh, no problem. So I have some PDFs that I've put in, put into Hypothesis
Mhm.
because I want to separate that reading so that some students are commenting on a certain number of pages of the document, and then another group is commenting on the other pages of that document. So there'll be two groups working with it. And then I also want the entire class to be able to view the annotations both groups have made on that document.
Okay,
And
that's
so
something
I'm,
you couldn't automatically do that with the groups tool. To use a groups tool, you'd have to have separate instances of the PDFs that were available to each group to do the separate annotation. But what you could do is in the directions, you could just create the hypothesis link to the PDF and then just tell students, that group 1 should comment on these pages only, group 2 should comment on these pages. And that way everyone would have access, but they'd have to follow the directions and comment within that block. I don't think there's I don't know of any way in which you could have a hypothesis document that would be accessible only in part to one group, part to another, and then for the whole class. Because once you create that document, the same rights are persistent from then on. So you'd either need to do it with a group access to a portion of the document or have the document available to everyone. And I don't know of any way of changing it back and forth.
okay. Okay, so that helps me know like helps me think about how I want to arrange.
You could have group instructions where the instructions for group 1 would be to comment on these pages only. Instructions
Right.
for group 2 would be to comment on those and so forth.
Right. So, yeah, so I'll do that then. Okay.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
just to wrap things up, because I'm over time and Kathi is waiting in the wings to kick me out of the way because she's very enthusiastic to give her presentation.
Take your